The morning sun cast long shadows across the naval training facility in San Diego as Lieutenant Sarah Chen adjusted her gear one final time. At 5 feet 4 inches tall and weighing barely 130 pounds, she looked almost comical standing among the towering figures of SEAL Team 7. The men around her were legends in their own right, each one a product of the most grueling military training program in the world. They had survived Hell Week, conquered impossible missions, and earned their Trident badges through blood, sweat, and unwavering determination. Sarah wasn't a SEAL. She was a Marine Corps combat engineer who had been specially assigned to test a new piece of equipment that the Navy was considering for their elite forces. The device was a revolutionary underwater demolition tool that could cut through reinforced steel in half the time of traditional methods. The brass wanted to see if it could give their special operations teams an edge in hostile environments. The SEALs had been using their current equipment for years, and they had just completed what they considered their fastest underwater demolition time ever. 42 minutes to breach a simulated enemy submarine hull and plant charges at 3 critical points. It was a record that had taken months of practice to achieve, and they were justifiably proud of their accomplishment. Chief Petty Officer Mike Rodriguez, a 15-year veteran with arms like tree trunks, wiped the salt water from his face as he emerged from the training pool. His team members gathered around him, still buzzing with adrenaline from their record-breaking performance. They had shaved nearly 3 minutes off their previous best time, and the precision of their work had been flawless. 42 minutes, gentlemen, Rodriguez announced with a grin that revealed a chipped front tooth, earned during a mission in Afghanistan. That's what happens when you've got the best underwater demo team in the Navy. The other team members nodded in agreement, their confidence well earned through years of dangerous missions in some of the world's most hostile waters. Petty Officer First Class Danny Torres, known for his quick wit and faster swimming speed, was already planning how they would celebrate this achievement. Sergeant Marcus Williams, the team's explosives expert, was mentally cataloging every movement they had made, looking for ways to potentially shave off even more time in future runs. That's when Sarah stepped forward, her new equipment pack secured tightly to her back. The SEALs had been aware of her presence, but most had assumed she was there merely as an observer. Her request caught them completely off guard. "Mind if I have a turn?" she asked casually, as if she were asking to borrow a pencil rather than challenging some of the military's most elite operators. The reaction was immediate and predictable. Laughter erupted from the group. Not malicious, but genuinely amused by what they perceived as either incredible confidence or complete naivety. Rodriguez chuckled and shook his head, water droplets flying from his close-cropped hair. "Ma'am, with all due respect," Rodriguez said, his voice carrying the patient tone of someone explaining something obvious to a child, "this isn't exactly a beginner-level exercise. We've been training for this specific scenario for 6 months. That time we just posted represents years of experience and specialized training." Torres jumped in with his characteristic humor. "Plus, that water's pretty cold. You sure you want to get wet just to prove a point?" Williams, always the professional, tried to be more diplomatic. "Look, Marine, we appreciate your enthusiasm, but underwater demolition is a highly specialized skill. It's not just about the equipment. It's about understanding water pressure, managing your air supply, working in zero visibility conditions, and maintaining precision while your body is fighting hypothermia." Sarah listened patiently to their explanations, her expression never changing from its calm, determined state. She had expected this reaction. Throughout her military career, she had faced skepticism and doubt at every turn. As one of only a handful of female combat engineers in the Marines, she had grown accustomed to having to prove herself repeatedly. What the SEALs didn't know was that Sarah's background was far more extensive than her current assignment suggested. Before joining the Marines, she had been a competitive swimmer and diver, holding several state records in her home state of California. Her college degree was in mechanical engineering, with a specialty in underwater systems. She had spent 2 summers working on offshore oil rigs, becoming intimately familiar with underwater cutting and welding techniques. More importantly, she had spent the last 8 months not just learning to use the new equipment, but mastering it. While the SEALs had been perfecting their techniques with traditional tools, Sarah had been pushing the boundaries of what was possible with cutting-edge technology. She had run hundreds of simulations, practiced in pools, lakes, and ocean environments, and worked closely with the engineers who had developed the system. "I understand your concerns," Sarah replied calmly, beginning to check her diving gear with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done it thousands of times before. "But I'm not here to prove a point. I'm here to test equipment and gather data. The best way to do that is under realistic conditions, against a meaningful baseline." Rodriguez exchanged glances with his team members. There was something about her confidence that gave him pause. He had been in the military long enough to recognize the difference between bravado and genuine capability. Sarah's demeanor suggested the latter, but the logical part of his brain insisted that was impossible. "All right," he said finally, his voice taking on a slightly more serious tone. "But we run this by the book. Full safety protocols. Dive buddy assigned. Emergency procedures in place. And when you realize this is harder than it looks, we pull you out immediately. No heroics, no proving points." "Agreed?" Sarah nodded and continued her equipment check. She tested her regulator, verified her air supply, and ran through the safety checklist with methodical precision. The SEALs watched with growing interest as they realized her pre-dive routine was textbook perfect, executed with the kind of muscle memory that only came from extensive experience. The training scenario was designed to simulate breaching an enemy submarine that had been disabled but was still partially operational. 3 specific points on the hull needed to be compromised simultaneously to ensure the vessel couldn't restart its engines or fire its weapons. The underwater environment was deliberately challenging, with limited visibility, cross-currents, and obstacles designed to complicate navigation and precision work. As Sarah finished her preparations and moved toward the water's edge, the atmosphere among the SEALs began to shift. Their laughter had faded, replaced by curious attention. Whatever happened next, they realized, was going to be interesting. Sarah's entry into the water was flawless. There was no splash, no awkward adjustment period that typically marked inexperienced divers. She slipped beneath the surface like she belonged there, her movements fluid and economical. Chief Rodriguez, assigned as her safety diver, had to push himself to keep up with her initial descent. The training pool was designed to replicate ocean conditions as closely as possible. Artificial currents created realistic underwater challenges, while strategically placed obstacles and reduced lighting simulated the chaos of a real combat environment. The mock submarine hull sat 40 feet below the surface, a massive steel structure that had been reinforced to military specifications. As they descended, Rodriguez found himself reassessing his initial impressions. Sarah's swimming technique was not just competent, it was exceptional. She moved through the water with an efficiency that spoke of years of experience, her body position perfectly streamlined to minimize drag and conserve energy. More importantly, she showed no signs of the anxiety or disorientation that even experienced military personnel sometimes displayed in these artificial environments. The first target point was located on the submarine's port side, near what would have been the engine compartment on a real vessel. Using traditional cutting equipment, the SEALs had needed nearly 14 minutes to breach this section. The steel was 3 inches thick, reinforced with internal supports, and positioned at an awkward angle that required precise body positioning to access effectively. Sarah approached the target with methodical precision. She secured herself to the hull using magnetic anchoring points, a technique that demonstrated her understanding of underwater work positioning. The new cutting tool she carried looked deceptively simple, resembling a larger version of a plasma torch, but Rodriguez knew it incorporated technology that was years ahead of anything currently in military use. What happened next challenged everything Rodriguez thought he knew about underwater demolition work. Sarah's cutting tool activated with a barely perceptible hum, and the reinforced steel began to part like butter under a hot knife. The precision was extraordinary. Where the SEALs had needed to make multiple passes to ensure complete penetration, Sarah's single cut went through the entire thickness in one smooth motion. The edges of her cut were clean and precise, showing none of the rough, irregular marks that traditional cutting methods produced. But it wasn't just the equipment that impressed Rodriguez. It was the way Sarah used it. She understood exactly how much pressure to apply, how quickly to move, and how to maintain perfect control even while managing her position in the artificial current. Her technique was flawless, demonstrating a level of skill that typically took years to develop. The first breach point was completed in less than 4 minutes. Rodriguez checked his dive computer, certain he had misread the elapsed time. The SEAL's previous record for this single breach point had been 14 minutes, achieved after months of practice and refinement. Sarah had just accomplished the same task in roughly a quarter of the time, and her work appeared to be superior in quality. The second target was located on the submarine's upper hull, in a position that required swimming against the artificial current while maintaining precise control of cutting equipment. This was traditionally the most challenging part of the exercise, requiring exceptional physical conditioning and advanced diving skills. Many experienced operators struggled with this section, fighting against fatigue and the disorienting effects of working in an inverted position. Sarah's approach to this challenge was completely different from anything Rodriguez had observed before. Instead of fighting the current, she used it to her advantage, positioning herself so that the water flow actually helped stabilize her work position. It was a technique that demonstrated not just skill, but innovative thinking under pressure. Her cutting work on the second breach point was even more impressive than the first. The angle was difficult, requiring her to work essentially upside down while maintaining millimeter precision. The SEALs had always considered this the most technically demanding part of the exercise, but Sarah completed it with the same calm efficiency she had shown throughout the dive. The second breach was completed in just over 5 minutes. By this point, Rodriguez was no longer thinking about safety protocols or wondering if Sarah could handle the exercise. He was watching a master craftsman at work, someone whose skill level exceeded anything he had previously encountered. His radio communication with the surface team reflected his growing amazement. Surface control. "This is Dive Team Alpha," he reported through his waterproof communication system. "Subject has completed breach points 1 and 2. Times are... well, you're not going to believe these times." The voice of Lieutenant Commander Patricia Hayes, the exercise supervisor, crackled back through the water. "Copy that, Alpha. What are we looking at?" Rodriguez glanced at his dive computer again, still having trouble believing what he was seeing. 4 minutes on point 1, 5, and change on point 2. And the quality of work it's exceptional. There was a pause from surface control. Hayes had been monitoring the exercise from the beginning, and she knew these times were unprecedented. "Confirm those numbers, Alpha." "Confirmed. And we're moving to breach point 3. The third and final breach point was positioned on the submarine's lower hull, in a section designed to simulate the most challenging possible conditions. The target area was partially obscured by mock debris, requiring the operator to work in extremely limited space while maintaining cutting precision. Additionally, this section incorporated the thickest steel in the entire exercise, representing armor plating that would protect a submarine's most critical systems. The SEALs had always approached this final breach with a combination of determination and resignation. Even with their record-setting performance that morning, this section had taken them nearly 18 minutes to complete. The confined space, thick armor, and accumulated fatigue made it the most grueling part of the entire exercise. Sarah's approach to the final breach point revealed another level of her expertise. She analyzed the confined space for several seconds, planning her positioning and cutting sequence before beginning work. When she finally started cutting, her movements were even more economical than before. Each motion calculated for maximum efficiency. The advanced cutting tool performed flawlessly, but Rodriguez realized that the equipment was only part of the equation. Sarah's technique maximized the tool's capabilities in ways that suggested she understood its operation at a fundamental level. She wasn't just using the equipment, she was exploiting every advantage it offered. As the final section of steel fell away, completing the third breach point, Rodriguez checked his dive computer one more time. The third breach had taken less than 8 minutes, and the total mission time was just approaching the 20-minute mark. The SEAL's record time had been 42 minutes. Sarah had just completed the same exercise in roughly half that time, and her work quality exceeded anything they had achieved. As they began their ascent to the surface, Rodriguez found himself grappling with the implications of what he had just witnessed. This wasn't just about new equipment or innovative techniques. This was a fundamental redefinition of what was possible in underwater demolition operations. The woman swimming beside him had just made some of the Navy's most elite operators look like beginners. When Sarah's head broke the surface of the training pool, the first thing she noticed was the silence. The usual post-exercise chatter that typically filled the deck area was completely absent. Instead, she found herself looking up at a circle of faces that wore expressions ranging from disbelief to something approaching awe. Chief Rodriguez surfaced beside her, shaking his head as he pulled out his regulator. Surface control, Dive Team Alpha returning. Exercise complete. Total mission time. He paused, as if saying the numbers out loud might somehow make them less real. 19 minutes and 43 seconds. The silence that followed this announcement was deafening. Even Lieutenant Commander Hayes, monitoring from the observation deck, seemed momentarily speechless. The exercise timer on the facility's main display board continued to run, showing numbers that defied everything the assembled personnel thought they knew about underwater demolition operations. Petty Officer Torres was the first to find his voice. 19 minutes? That's impossible. The prep time alone usually takes longer than that. Sergeant Williams, still dripping from his own recent dive, stared at the timer display as if it might suddenly correct itself to show more believable numbers. Chief, are you sure about that time? Because our record run this morning took 42 minutes, and that was with everything going perfectly. Rodriguez hauled himself out of the pool, water streaming from his diving gear. I checked the computer 3 times, Williams. 19 minutes, 43 seconds, and that includes descent time, navigation between breach points, and ascent. The actual cutting work was maybe 12 minutes total. Sarah pulled herself onto the pool deck with the same efficient economy of movement she had displayed underwater. She began her post-dive equipment check with methodical precision, seemingly oblivious to the stunned reactions around her. Her breathing was steady and controlled, showing no signs of the exertion that typically followed such intensive underwater work. "Ma'am," Torres said, his earlier humor replaced by genuine confusion. "How exactly did you do that? I mean, we've been training with this scenario for months. We know every angle, every challenge, every possible shortcut. What we just saw shouldn't be possible." Sarah looked up from her equipment check, her expression remaining calm and professional. The new cutting system operates on plasma arc technology with magnetic field containment. It's roughly 4 times more efficient than traditional cutting tools, and the precision allows for single-pass cuts on materials up to 6 inches thick. Williams frowned, his engineer's mind trying to process this information. "Okay, but that still doesn't explain the navigation speed, the positioning efficiency, or the fact that you seemed to know exactly what you were doing down there. No disrespect intended, but underwater demo work isn't something you pick up from a training manual." For the first time since surfacing, Sarah smiled. "You're absolutely right, Sergeant. I've been diving for 22 years, starting with competitive swimming in high school. I spent 4 summers working underwater construction on offshore oil platforms. Before my current assignment, I completed the Navy's combat swimmer course and qualified as a master diver in the Marine Corps. The implications of this revelation began to sink in among the SEALs." Rodriguez whistled low under his breath. "Master diver qualification. That explains a few things. But that still leaves the question of how you cut our time in half." Lieutenant Commander Hayes made her way down from the observation deck, her expression thoughtful rather than celebratory. She understood that what they had just witnessed represented far more than a simple equipment demonstration. The potential implications for special operations capabilities were staggering. "Chen," Hayes said as she approached the group, "that was an impressive demonstration. But I need to understand exactly what we're looking at here. Is this performance repeatable? Are we seeing the absolute optimal conditions? Or is this representative of what we can expect in field operations?" Sarah finished stowing her equipment and turned to face the growing crowd of observers. Word of the unprecedented performance had spread quickly through the facility, and personnel from other units had begun gathering to hear first-hand accounts of what had happened. "Commander, the equipment performed exactly as designed. The time advantage comes from several factors working together. The plasma cutting system is dramatically more efficient than traditional tools, but equally important is the precision it allows. Instead of multiple passes and cleanup work, each cut can be completed in a single, controlled motion. Hayes nodded, making notes on her waterproof tablet. What about environmental factors? This was a controlled environment. How would performance change in open ocean conditions, with limited visibility, stronger currents, and operational stress? The equipment actually performs better in saltwater than in the chlorinated pool environment, Sarah replied. The plasma arc is more stable in natural seawater, and the magnetic containment system is designed to function optimally under pressure. As for environmental challenges, proper training with the system should allow operators to maintain efficiency even under adverse conditions. Chief Rodriguez stepped closer, his professional interest overriding his personal ego. Chen, I need to ask this directly. Could you teach our people to use this equipment at your level of efficiency? Because if this performance is replicable, we're looking at a complete revolution in special operations capabilities. Sarah's answer surprised everyone within earshot. Chief, with respect, I think your people could exceed my performance within a month of proper training. You already have the diving skills, the tactical knowledge, and the operational experience. You just need to learn to think differently about the cutting process. Torres laughed, but it was a sound of amazement rather than skepticism. Think differently? Lady, you just did in 20 minutes what took us nearly an hour. I'm not sure thinking differently covers that kind of improvement. Actually, it does. Sarah replied seriously. Traditional underwater cutting requires you to fight against the material, to force your way through steel using heat and pressure. This system works with the molecular structure of the metal, using controlled plasma to essentially convince the steel to separate itself. It's a completely different approach that requires completely different techniques. Williams, always focused on practical applications, raised his hand like a student in a classroom. Can you show us some of those techniques? Because if this equipment is going to be standard issue for special operations, we need to understand how to maximize its potential. Hayes stepped forward, recognizing that they had moved beyond a simple equipment demonstration into something much more significant. Chen, I think we need to schedule some extended training sessions. This performance changes everything we thought we knew about underwater demolition capabilities. As the group began to disperse, Rodriguez lingered near the pool edge, staring down into the water where Sarah had just rewritten the rules of underwater operations. His mind was racing through the implications of what he had witnessed. 42 minutes had been their best time ever, achieved through months of practice and refinement. It had represented the absolute pinnacle of what they believed was possible with traditional equipment and conventional techniques. That time had been their pride, their proof that SEAL Team 7 was among the elite of the elite. In less than 20 minutes, a Marine Corps engineer had made their achievement look pedestrian. But as Rodriguez thought about it more, his initial ego bruising began to transform into something else entirely. Excitement. If Sarah was right about their ability to learn these new techniques, if this performance was truly replicable, then they weren't looking at being replaced or outdone. They were looking at becoming capable of operations that had previously been considered impossible. The laughter that had greeted Sarah's initial request now seemed like it had happened in a different lifetime, when they had been different people with different understanding of what was possible. 3 weeks later, the training facility had been transformed into what looked like a cutting-edge research laboratory. Banks of monitoring equipment lined the observation deck, recording every aspect of the intensive training program that had been hastily organized around Sarah's revolutionary techniques. The Navy had moved quickly once they understood the implications of her performance, assembling a team of engineers, training specialists, and operational commanders to develop a comprehensive curriculum. Chief Rodriguez stood at the edge of the pool, no longer the confident veteran who had dismissed Sarah's abilities. The past 21 days had been humbling in ways he hadn't expected. Learning to use the new cutting system had required him to essentially forget everything he thought he knew about underwater demolition and start over from the beginning. The hardest part isn't the equipment, he confided to Sergeant Williams during a brief break between training sessions. It's rewiring your brain to think about the physics differently. For 15 years, I've approached cutting operations like I'm attacking the steel. Sarah's technique is more like surgery. Williams nodded. flexing his hands to work out the cramping that came from holding the plasma cutting tool in the precise grip that Sarah had demonstrated. "I know what you mean. Yesterday I finally had a breakthrough moment where everything clicked. Instead of forcing the cut, I felt like I was guiding it. Cut a 6-inch steel plate in 47 seconds. That's progress," Rodriguez acknowledged. "My best time is still over a minute for the same cut. But 3 weeks ago, that same cut would have taken me 8 minutes with traditional equipment." Sarah's right about the performance curve being steep once you understand the principles. Across the deck area, Petty Officer Torres was studying video footage of Sarah's original demonstration, frame by frame, trying to understand the subtle positioning adjustments that allowed her to work with such incredible efficiency. The more he studied her technique, the more he realized how much precision was involved in movements that had appeared effortless during the live demonstration. "Look at this," Torres called out, pointing to a specific sequence on his tablet. "Watch how she adjusts her body position just before starting the second cut. It's maybe a 2-inch movement, but it changes her leverage completely. That tiny adjustment probably saves 30 seconds of cutting time." Sarah appeared beside him, moving with the quiet efficiency that had become familiar over the past weeks. "You're starting to see the interconnections," she said approvingly. "Every aspect of positioning affects cutting efficiency. Distance from the target, angle of approach, even the way you distribute your weight against the anchoring points." Torres looked up from the tablet, his expression showing the kind of focused concentration that came from encountering a completely new way of thinking about familiar problems. "It's like learning to dive all over again. Everything I thought I knew about working underwater has to be reconsidered." "That's exactly right," Sarah replied. "But you're also discovering capabilities you didn't know you had. Your natural diving instincts are actually better than you realized. You just needed to apply them differently." The training program had been intense by any military standard. 8 hours a day in the water, followed by classroom sessions on plasma physics, equipment maintenance, and tactical applications. The SEALs had approached it with the same determination they brought to any challenge, but the learning curve had been steeper than anyone anticipated. Lieutenant Commander Hayes had been monitoring every aspect of the training, and her daily reports to Naval Special Warfare Command reflected both the challenges and the extraordinary potential of the new system. The latest equipment tests had shown that properly trained operators could achieve cutting speeds that were 4 to 6 times faster than traditional methods, with superior precision and reduced physical fatigue. "The implications for mission planning are staggering," Hayes explained during a video conference with Pentagon officials. "Operations that previously required extensive prep time and multiple personnel can now be accomplished by smaller teams in dramatically reduced timeframes. We're looking at a fundamental shift in what's possible for underwater special operations." The response from Naval Special Warfare Command had been immediate and comprehensive. Additional training facilities were being established at bases across the country, and acquisition orders for the new cutting systems had been fast-tracked through the procurement process. Sarah had been temporarily reassigned to help develop standardized training protocols that could be implemented Navy-wide. But the most significant changes were happening in the attitudes and capabilities of the SEAL team members who were serving as the initial test group. Their progress over 3 weeks had been remarkable, even by their own high standards. Chief Rodriguez had progressed from complete confusion about the new techniques to achieving cutting times that were consistently under 2 minutes for standard breach procedures. More importantly, he had begun to understand how the improved efficiency would translate into operational advantages in real-world scenarios. "The tactical implications are what really matter," Rodriguez explained to a group of visiting officers from other SEAL teams. "Yes, we can cut faster and more precisely, but what that means is that we can complete missions with smaller teams, reduced exposure time, and less equipment. In hostile environments, those advantages can mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure." Sergeant Williams had taken a different approach to mastering the new system, applying his engineering background to understand the plasma cutting process at a molecular level. His technical insights had led to several refinements in operational procedures that improved both safety and efficiency. "The beautiful thing about this technology is that it's scalable," Williams noted during a technical briefing. "The same principles that allow us to cut through submarine hulls can be applied to breaching reinforced doors, disabling vehicle armor, or creating emergency access points. We're not just learning a new demolition technique, we're gaining a completely new operational capability. Petty Officer Torres had discovered an unexpected aptitude for the precision aspects of the new cutting system. His progress had been so rapid that Sarah had begun using him as a demonstration partner for visiting observers, showcasing how quickly experienced operators could adapt to the new techniques. "The learning curve is steep but short," Torres reported to Hayes during one of their daily progress assessments. "The first week was brutal because everything felt wrong, but once you understand the fundamental differences in approach, the improvements come quickly. My cutting times have improved by a factor of 5 since day one." As the fourth week of training began, the team's confidence had been completely transformed. Where they had initially approached the new equipment with skepticism and concern about their ability to master unfamiliar techniques, they now displayed the quiet confidence that came from genuine expertise. The morning's exercise involved a complex scenario that combined multiple breach points with tactical movement underwater, simulating a real-world mission against a heavily defended target. Using traditional equipment and techniques, such an exercise would have required a full team and taken several hours to complete. Sarah watched from the observation deck as the 3 SEALs descended into the training pool, moving with the coordinated precision that marked truly elite operators. Their equipment handling was now flawless, their positioning optimal, and their cutting techniques approaching her own level of efficiency. "Ready to see what they can really do?" she asked Hayes, who was monitoring multiple data streams from the exercise. Hayes nodded, her attention focused on the real-time performance data flowing across her screens. "If they can complete this exercise in under 30 minutes with the quality standards we've established, we'll have proof that this training program can produce the results we need for fleet-wide implementation." 27 minutes later, as the 3 SEALs surfaced after completing what had once been considered a nearly impossible exercise, Hayes was already drafting her recommendation for immediate program expansion. 6 months after Sarah's initial demonstration, the phone in Chief Rodriguez's quarters rang at 0300 hours, with the sharp urgency that every special operations veteran recognized. Mission alert. As he reached for the secure handset, Rodriguez felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that preceded deployment. But this time, it was mixed with anticipation, rather than routine acceptance. This would be the first real-world test of everything they had learned. "Chief, this is operations. We need your team ready for immediate deployment. Briefing in Conference Room Alpha at 0400. This is a Priority 1 mission utilizing the new cutting systems." Rodriguez was already reaching for his gear bag before the caller finished speaking. "Copy that. We'll be there." Within minutes, the corridors of the Naval Special Warfare Facility were alive with purposeful activity. Rodriguez, Williams, and Torres moved through their pre-deployment routine with the mechanical precision that came from years of practice. But each man was quietly aware that this mission would be different from anything they had done before. The briefing room was already crowded when they arrived. Lieutenant Commander Hayes stood at the front, flanked by intelligence officers and tactical planners. Maps and satellite imagery covered the walls, and multiple computer screens displayed real-time intelligence feeds. "Gentlemen," Hayes began without preamble, 18 hours ago, international terrorists seized control of a cargo vessel in the Indian Ocean. The ship is carrying a legitimate cargo of industrial chemicals that could be weaponized if processed correctly. The terrorists have welded additional armor plating around the ship's critical systems and are threatening to scuttle the vessel in shipping lanes if their demands aren't met. Williams studied the satellite images, his engineer's eye automatically analyzing the modifications visible on the ship's superstructure. "Commander, those armor modifications look like they're designed specifically to defeat traditional cutting equipment. Multiple layers, irregular angles, reinforcement behind the primary plating." Hayes nodded grimly. "Intelligence believes the terrorists anticipated a conventional boarding and cutting operation. They've essentially turned the ship into a floating fortress. Using traditional methods, a breach operation would take hours and require a much larger team, creating unacceptable risk of detection and casualties." Torres leaned forward, studying the tactical assessment data. "What about the crew? Are we looking at a hostage situation?" 15 crew members are being held in the ship's forward compartment, Hayes replied. The terrorist team consists of 8 individuals with military training and sophisticated equipment. They've established defensive positions throughout the ship and have threatened to execute hostages if they detect any boarding attempt. Rodriguez absorbed the information, his mind already working through the tactical challenges. Time constraints? Commander, the ship is currently in international waters, but it's moving toward a major shipping lane. If it reaches that position and the terrorists follow through on their threat to scuttle, we're looking at environmental disaster and significant disruption to international commerce. We have a narrow window for intervention. Hayes activated a 3-dimensional display showing the target vessel from multiple angles. This is where your new capabilities become critical. Using the plasma cutting system, you should be able to breach the armored sections in minutes rather than hours. The mission plan calls for simultaneous breaches at 3 points, allowing for rapid access and minimal time for terrorist response. The mission parameters were unlike anything the team had attempted before, but Rodriguez realized that 6 months earlier, such an operation would have been impossible with conventional equipment. The terrorists' defensive preparations were specifically designed to counter traditional SEAL tactics, but they had no way to anticipate the new cutting capabilities. Recovery timeline? Williams asked, already calculating equipment requirements and logistics. You'll be inserted by submersible 2 kilometers from the target vessel, Hayes explained. Approach underwater to minimize detection, conduct the breach operation, secure the hostages, and neutralize the terrorist threat. Total mission time from insertion to extraction is estimated at 4 hours maximum. Torres studied the underwater approach routes displayed on the tactical screens. What about support assets? Are we going in alone? Negative. You'll have full tactical support, including real-time intelligence, medical evacuation capability, and backup forces if needed. But the initial breach and assault will be conducted by your 3-man team to minimize the risk of detection. As the briefing continued, Rodriguez found himself reflecting on how dramatically their capabilities had evolved. 6 months earlier, a mission like this would have required a much larger team, extensive preparation time, and significant risk of discovery during the lengthy cutting operations. The new plasma system had fundamentally changed what was possible for a small special operations team. 8 hours later, the team was aboard a nuclear submarine, moving through the dark waters of the Indian Ocean toward their target. The submarine's sophisticated sensors provided continuous updates on the location and status of the terrorist-controlled vessel, while the team made final preparations for their underwater approach. Sarah had insisted on joining the mission as a technical advisor, her expertise with the cutting system considered too valuable to leave behind. She worked alongside the team's equipment specialists, conducting final checks on the plasma cutting units and reviewing optimal cutting sequences for the specific armor configurations they would encounter. The key to this operation is simultaneity, Sarah explained as they gathered around a scale model of the target vessel. If the terrorists detect the first breach before the others are complete, they'll have time to respond. We need all 3 cutting operations to finish within 30 seconds of each other. Williams examined the cutting points marked on the model. The armor thickness varies significantly between the 3 locations. How do we synchronize completion times when we're dealing with different material densities? Cutting sequence and power settings, Sarah replied, adjusting controls on one of the plasma units. Location: 1 has the thickest armor but the most direct angle of approach. Location 2 is thinner material but requires cutting around structural reinforcements. Location 3 is intermediate thickness but positioned where current flow will affect cutting efficiency. Rodriguez studied the tactical implications. So we're not just coordinating timing. We're coordinating technique. Each cutting position requires different approaches to achieve simultaneous completion. Exactly. And that's why your training over the past 6 months was so important. You're not just operating equipment. You're applying adaptive techniques under operational pressure. Torres checked his diving gear one final time, running through the mental checklist that had become second nature during their intensive training. The weight of responsibility was different now. In training, failure meant disappointment and the need to repeat exercises. Here, failure meant innocent people would die. As the submarine approached the final coordinates, the team received their last intelligence update. The terrorist-controlled vessel was maintaining course and speed, with no indication that their presence had been detected. Thermal imaging showed the locations of sentries on deck, while sonar mapping confirmed the underwater approach route was clear. "Final equipment check," Rodriguez announced, his voice carrying the calm authority that marked experienced operators under pressure. Each team member verified their cutting equipment, diving gear, and communication systems. The plasma cutting units had been modified for this specific mission, with power settings pre-programmed for the expected armor configurations. Sarah conducted a final technical briefing on the cutting sequences. "Remember, these aren't the controlled conditions we trained in. Ocean currents, water temperature, and the ship's movement will all affect your technique. Trust your training, but be ready to adapt." The submarine's captain announced they had reached the insertion point, 2 kilometers from the target vessel. The water was dark and cold, with moderate currents that would complicate the approach but provide concealment from surface detection systems. Rodriguez led the team through the submarine's escape hatch, emerging into the black water of the Indian Ocean. The contrast with their training environment was immediate and stark. Instead of the controlled clarity of the training pool, they found themselves in an underwater world of limited visibility, temperature variations, and unpredictable currents. But as they began their approach swim toward the target vessel, Rodriguez realized that their training had prepared them for exactly these conditions. Sarah had insisted on progressively more challenging environments throughout their instruction, culminating in ocean training that replicated the difficulties they now faced. The swim to the target took 47 minutes, with the team maintaining perfect formation despite the challenging conditions. As they approached the hull of the terrorist-controlled vessel, they could hear the muffled sounds of activity above deck, confirming that their underwater approach had gone undetected. The ship's hull loomed above them in the darkness, its massive steel plates scarred with the additional armor modifications that had been hastily welded into place. Rodriguez studied the defensive modifications through his night vision system, noting that the terrorists had indeed prepared for conventional cutting attempts. The additional plating was thick, irregularly positioned, and backed with structural reinforcements designed to slow traditional demolition work to a crawl. Using hand signals, Rodriguez directed his team to their assigned cutting positions. Williams moved to the forward location, where the thickest armor protected what intelligence believed to be the ship's communication center. Torres took the midship position, targeting the armored section around the engine control room. Rodriguez positioned himself at the aft location, where the terrorists had reinforced the area around the ship's steering mechanisms. Each team member activated their cutting equipment and began the careful positioning process that Sarah had drilled into them during months of training. The plasma units hummed to life with barely audible power, their advanced design minimizing noise that might alert the terrorists above. Rodriguez initiated the synchronized cutting sequence with a brief radio signal. Simultaneously, 3 points on the ship's armored hull began to glow with the controlled plasma arcs that would slice through steel like paper. The months of training had prepared them for this moment, but the reality of applying their new skills in a life-or-death situation added intensity that no simulation could replicate. Williams encountered the first complication when his cutting arc revealed that the forward armor was actually a double-layer system, with an air gap between 2 steel plates designed to dissipate cutting heat. It was exactly the kind of defensive modification that would have stopped traditional equipment, but his training with Sarah had covered similar configurations. He adjusted his cutting pattern and power settings, using a technique they had practiced for defeating layered armor systems. Instead of attempting to cut through both layers simultaneously, he used rapid, precise cuts to defeat each layer separately, completing the breach in just under 3 minutes. Torres faced a different challenge at his midship position. The armor modifications included internal bracing that created an irregular cutting pattern, requiring him to navigate around structural supports while maintaining cutting precision. His months of training in adaptive technique allowed him to modify his approach in real time, following the path of least resistance while maintaining the structural integrity needed for the tactical breach. Rodriguez's aft position presented the most complex cutting requirements, with multiple angles and varying material thickness that demanded constant adjustment of technique and power settings. But as he worked through the sequence, he realized that the skills Sarah had taught them had become instinctive. His hands moved with practiced precision, making the subtle adjustments needed to maintain optimal cutting efficiency despite the challenging conditions. 18 minutes after beginning the cutting sequence, all 3 team members signaled completion of their breach points. The timing was nearly perfect, with less than 20 seconds separating the first and last completions. More importantly, the quality of their work had created access points large enough for rapid tactical entry while maintaining the structural integrity of the surrounding hull. As they prepared for the next phase of the mission, Rodriguez reflected on how completely their capabilities had been transformed. 6 months earlier, breaching these defensive modifications would have been impossible within mission time constraints. The terrorists' preparations, designed to defeat conventional special operations tactics, had been overcome by techniques that didn't exist when their defensive plans were made. 2 years after that successful mission in the Indian Ocean, Chief Rodriguez stood before an auditorium filled with special operations personnel from around the world. The International Special Operations Conference had become the premier forum for sharing tactical innovations, and Rodriguez had been invited to present the operational results of what was now known throughout the military as the Chen Protocol. The statistics he shared were impressive by any measure. Mission success rates for underwater demolition operations had improved by 340%. Average mission duration had decreased by 60%, while team size requirements had been reduced by half. Most significantly, casualty rates for special operations involving underwater cutting had dropped to near zero, as the reduced exposure times eliminated many of the traditional risk factors. But as Rodriguez looked out at the audience of hardened military professionals, he realized that the numbers only told part of the story. The real transformation had been in how they thought about what was possible. The technology was important, he explained to the assembled officers and operators, but the breakthrough was learning to think differently about the fundamental challenges we face. Lieutenant Chen didn't just bring us better equipment, she taught us to approach familiar problems from completely new angles. In the audience, Sarah sat quietly in civilian clothes, having transitioned out of active duty 6 months earlier. She had been recruited by a private defense contractor to lead the development of next-generation special operations equipment, but her influence on military training doctrine continued to expand throughout special operations communities worldwide. The presentation continued with detailed case studies from the past 2 years. The Indian Ocean mission had been followed by dozens of successful operations that would have been impossible or prohibitively dangerous using traditional methods. Hostage rescues, counter-terrorism operations, and strategic reconnaissance missions had all benefited from the enhanced capabilities that the new cutting technology provided. Sergeant Williams, now promoted to Chief Petty Officer, had become the Navy's leading instructor for the plasma cutting systems. His technical background and operational experience had made him the ideal candidate to train new generations of operators in the advanced techniques that were becoming standard throughout the special operations community. The learning curve is steep but manageable, Williams explained during his portion of the presentation. Most experienced operators can achieve basic proficiency within 3 weeks of intensive training. Advanced capabilities take longer to develop, but the performance improvements justify the investment in time and resources. Torres had taken a different path, applying his newfound expertise to mission planning and tactical development. His insights into how the new cutting capabilities changed operational possibilities had led to completely revised doctrine for underwater special operations. Missions that had previously required extensive planning and large support teams could now be accomplished by small units with minimal preparation time. The strategic implications extend far beyond underwater operations, Torres noted in his section of the presentation. When you can breach any target in minutes instead of hours, when you can operate with smaller teams and reduced equipment loads, you fundamentally change what's possible in terms of tactical surprise and operational flexibility. The audience questions that followed the presentation reflected both professional interest and healthy skepticism. Many of the assembled operators had heard impressive claims about new equipment before, only to discover that real-world performance fell short of laboratory demonstrations. A British SAS officer raised his hand. Chief Rodriguez, these performance improvements are impressive. But how do they translate to operations in extremely hostile environments? What happens when you're working under direct fire, in contaminated water, or against targets that are actively trying to counter your breach attempts? Rodriguez smiled. recognizing the question as one he had asked himself 2 years earlier. Commander, that's exactly the right question to ask. The answer is that challenging conditions actually amplify the advantages of the new system rather than diminishing them. When you can complete cutting operations in minutes instead of hours, when you need smaller teams and less equipment, hostile environments become more manageable rather than more difficult. A German GSG-9 operator followed up. What about equipment reliability? Complex technology tends to fail at critical moments. How has the plasma cutting system performed under actual operational stress? Williams stepped forward to address this concern. In 2 years of operational use, we've experienced a failure rate of less than 2%, and most of those failures were due to operator error rather than equipment malfunction. The system is actually more reliable than traditional cutting equipment because it has fewer mechanical components and operates more efficiently. Sarah had remained silent throughout most of the presentation, but during the question period, a U.S. Army Ranger officer addressed her directly. Ma'am, you've revolutionized special operations capabilities, but what comes next? Are there other areas where similar thinking could produce comparable improvements? Sarah stood to answer, her presence commanding immediate attention from the audience. The plasma cutting breakthrough was really about applying advanced materials science to tactical problems. Similar approaches are being developed for everything from lightweight armor systems to advanced communication equipment. The key is understanding that technological capability often exists years before military applications are developed. She paused, looking around the auditorium at the assembled operators. But the most important lesson isn't about technology at all. It's about being willing to challenge assumptions about what's possible. Chief Rodriguez and his team didn't just learn to use new equipment. They learned to think about familiar problems in completely new ways. The conference continued for 3 more days, with detailed technical sessions, hands-on demonstrations, and tactical planning workshops. But the impact of the presentation extended far beyond the immediate audience. Within months, special operations units from allied nations had begun implementing similar training programs, while defense contractors worldwide were developing related technologies based on the principles that Sarah had pioneered. A year later, Rodriguez received news that would have seemed impossible during those first laughing moments at the training pool. The Chen Protocol had been adopted as standard doctrine by NATO Special Operations Forces, and Sarah's original equipment design had been selected for production by defense contractors in 7 different countries. But perhaps the most satisfying development came in a personal email from Sarah, now leading a research team developing next-generation equipment for Special Operations Forces worldwide. Chief, she wrote, I saw the news about your promotion to senior chief. Congratulations on a well-deserved recognition. I also wanted you to know that the techniques you and your team developed during our training have become the foundation for everything we're doing now. You didn't just learn to use new equipment. You helped invent new ways of thinking about special operations. She concluded with a line that brought back memories of that first day at the training pool. Mind if I have a turn asking you for advice now? Our next project involves applying similar principles to aerial insertion techniques, and I'd love to get your input on operational requirements. Rodriguez leaned back in his chair, remembering the mixture of amusement and skepticism that had greeted Sarah's initial request. The woman who had seemed so out of place among the towering SEALs had not only proven herself, she had fundamentally changed how they understood their own capabilities. The laughter that had filled the deck area that morning now seemed like an echo from a different world, when they had been different people with smaller ideas about what was possible. Sarah's quiet question, mind if I have a turn, had become the starting point for a revolution in special operations capability that continued to expand around the world. As he began composing his reply to Sarah's email, Rodriguez reflected on the most important lesson from their collaboration. Sometimes the most significant breakthroughs come not from obvious sources of expertise, but from unexpected perspectives that challenge fundamental assumptions about familiar problems. The achievement they were most proud of now wasn't the record-breaking times or the successful missions. It was the knowledge that they had learned to see beyond the limits they had once accepted as unchangeable.